Peace, chiefs, and deers. It's Bronzebird with another video. Before I begin, like and subscribe. Today's video I'm going to keep very short because this is a question that we have to ask ourselves and, really be honest about our truths and what is it that we talk about as so-called black people living in America or in the Western world. And with that being said, I want to bring upon the topic of conversation about, can black people or so-called black people culturally appropriate? And to the odds of things, so-called black people as a majority usually are always looking for an answer to know who they are. Some may float to the Hebrew Israelite type of narrative. Some may float to the Pan-Africanism type of narrative. Some may float to the Aboriginal American narrative. And then there's all these different branches that is supposed to be adequate to the so-called black experience. Certain people get a little bit too bold and arrogant, and they might say things like, well, we started life, we started civilization, we are the original people. And if you understand through history, I can understand why that's true based upon the books that I've read and the research I've done, so I understand where people is coming from. But then there's a stake where so-called black people may wear things like a kimono or wear things relative to Asian culture or different cultures around the world. So is there ever a call out when a so-called black person decides to wear something that is relative to a particular culture and not be called a culture vulture or a person who's trying to take over the culture of somebody else? Now, we usually do see this with so-called white people, where so-called white people may wear something and people might say that that white person is culturally appropriating. But do we change that type of mindset when a so-called black person does it? Now, I get it. It's certain people that may want to come into their culture, know where they come from, or feel attached to something. But who's to say that you're not doing the same thing and that there's more of a leeway on you as a so-called black person because you are being placed in a box as the minority, quote unquote. Now, this is what I'm trying to think and I'm trying to understand. Don't get upset. Just understand where I'm coming from. Let's take, for example, a lot of people is involved in Pan-Africanism. A lot of people may say that they're from particular tribes in Africa. They might say that they're African and all these different things. Now, this is a difference. If it's been told by your family members that you have an African descent or you come from Africa straight off the boats, whatever have you, then I can understand you going ahead and doing certain things that is relative to the culture. But it's just the fact of the matter when certain people bring about Pan-Africanism, certain Africans may feel like you are culturally appropriating them and that things that they believe is relative to the motherland and all these different things is actually not. I want you guys to do a homework assignment for me. Look up the origin of where something like a daishiki comes from. Look that up for me. And I want you to get back to me on what you find out what the result is. And a lot of people may think that they know certain cultures and all these relative things. The escape in the mind of certain so-called African Americans, all they know is Africa. They don't know different tribes. They don't know the different areas. Some of them can't even name the 54 countries of Africa, but will say that they're African just off mere, acceptance and just because of Jesse Jackson's maniacal plan since 1988. You have that going on. Now, my focus is to the Aboriginal Americans. I have no problem with people, so-called black people, saying that they are the original people of the Americas and whatever have you. This is the problem. A lot of people wear war bonnets and wear these different things in their head or wear all the fringes or feathers saying that they're Native American or Aboriginal American and don't know anything about the tribes they associate themselves with. And this is the urban legend of a lot of so-called African Americans. A lot of times you ask the so-called African American if they are Aboriginal American, the first tribe that they mention is Cherokee. And that's not even the original name of the tribe. Now, it's been reported, allegedly, that it's Inuanya. Okay? And my reason for saying this is that people need to understand the context of cultural appropriation. And it could be a double standard based off what nationality you are. And I don't agree with certain people trying to appropriate cultures that might come from other so-called black people of the diaspora. But I just want to give a perspective where, do you think that when it comes to cultural appropriation, so-called black people can be a pusher of cultural appropriation or not? Do you believe so-called black people can culturally appropriate, or can't they? If a so-called black person wants to be into the Asian culture, I'm not going to necessarily say anime, but they may be into things that might be relative to the Habesha, which I don't think is, whatever it is that has to deal with the Japanese culture and all these different things. Is that cultural appropriation? Do you call a so-called black person out when they start to adapt some type of Japanese cultural way of saying? What about, well, I seen in a clip once that there was a so-called black man who got into music that comes from Mexico, and how he received a lot of flack, or how people were saying that he's trying to appropriate Mexican culture and that he's the N-word this and he's the N-word that. I want you guys to put this into your mind and just think about it and have more of a conversation to ask yourself, can so-called black people culturally appropriate? And if you guys are not familiar with something and you're just basing something off of something that's online, think twice about it. Not to say you need to consider how other people feel, but do you want to look like an ass to yourself? Or do you want to be honest about the difference between cultural appropriation and liking what you like? Subjective. Remember to like and subscribe. I have more videos on the way. Peace.